This is a legacy episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, originally released as part of the Lesbian Talk Show podcast group. Some references may be obsolete. The show looks at lesbian-relevant themes in history and literature, has interviews and discussions about current historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past, and presents new original historical fiction for your enjoyment. Today, the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast is delighted to welcome KJ Charles to the show. Welcome, KJ.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
KJ is a prolific author of queer historical fiction and historical fantasy, primarily featuring male characters. But I invited her on today to talk about her recent book, Proper English, which features a female couple. Perhaps you could start by telling our listeners a bit about the story.
Right, well, Proper English is set in early Edwardian England, so that's about 1903 or so. So right at the golden age when the Victorians had done all the amazing technological innovation, Britain was on top of the world, everything was absolutely marvellous. No possibility of anything bad happening in, say, 11 years or so. Everything's great if you're English, if you're white, if you're rich, etc. So it's a fun period to do. And it's also a period that's covered a lot in pulp novels, adventures, John Buchan, lots of stiff upper lip and daring do. All the early spy novels are starting. And it's just before Agatha Christie kicked in, but nevertheless, you already had a lovely range of detective stories, of country house stories, of country house murders. And there is nothing I like more than a country house murder. So I had I wrote a book called Think of England a few years ago, which is an romance set in an Edwardian country house, which had these two characters, Patricia Merton and Fenella Carruth, as secondary characters. And lots of people liked them. I liked them very much. So I thought I would write their origin story. And because Think of England was very much a sort of pulp spy thriller, I felt that Proper English needed to be a proper country house murder. So that is what I wrote. So we've got Pat Merton, who is ladies All England champion shot, goes up to her old friend's country house to meet his new fiancée, who is this very attractive, very bubbly, apparently completely airheaded industrial heiress. But unfortunately, the house is full of all sorts of the usual suspects of the country house, including the dreadful person who deserves to be murdered. And we go from there.
Yeah, you set it up very nicely with the classic, anybody could be the murderer, they've all got a good reason.
They all hate him. Everyone hates him. The biggest comment I'm getting back is, why does it take so long for him to be killed, and could we not see more of it? So I was struggling a bit when I wrote it, because I decided I wanted to write something light and frothy, but I also really felt like writing a murder. And you think, well, how can you make a murder feel good? And then you think, kill somebody everybody hates.
Yeah, I'm not sure frothy is a word I'd use to describe it, because the peril that leads to him being murdered is pretty dire for the characters involved.
It is pretty dire, yes. I'm not actually very good at writing frothy. I think I've managed one frothy book in my entire career. But I wanted to, I strove to, but failed. No, yes, I think it's it was a sort of line to tread between, on the one hand, you've got all this potential for disaster, but on the other hand, these people living this ridiculously privileged life.
Yes.
So it's quite fun to balance out.
Yeah, it fits very nicely into the overall romance genre of money porn, I think. It's like, let's give these characters enough money and power to do whatever they like, and then we can watch them and not have to be too jealous, because it's so separate from our lives. Yeah,
and I think it allows you to deal with all kinds of other, because so many problems do come back to money.
Yes.
And, we all face those every day. And it's a bit of a break from life to deal with problems that really can't be solved by throwing money at them. So you take a rich person, give them a problem they can't buy their way out of, like a murder. Mm-hmm. So I think it makes it enjoyable for the reader as well. I think you're right about that. I think we all enjoy the idea of, the beautiful dress, the servant, the fact that you don't have to do the washing up.
I'm thinking of all the contemporary romance novels with like high-powered executives and movie stars and all that, and then thinking those people don't necessarily actually really have time for romance, but whatever.
No, well, that's what I feel about high-powered executives. They always like take 3 weeks off and just go off to an island, and you think, I really don't think this is how high-powered executives. Also, you open the newspaper, you can see what high-powered executives look like. That's nobody's idea of a romantic fantasy.
I think with the the old-fashioned aristocracy, although your characters are not technically aristocracy, they're just like money and birth. But you can have that illusion that it could happen to anyone. That you could have handsome, personable people. They didn't have to claw their way to the top of industry first, and
yeah, exactly.
all those young, handsome Regency dukes just running around unmarried,
Yeah, no, I can't be having with dukes. I have to say it's a step too far for me. Just because I tend to be a bit obsessed with the power differential there, and dukes are just too powerful. There's if you're doing a duke that is anything more than just using duke as shorthand for really rich bloke, then the duke is too powerful. There's no peril, there's no actual threat, there's no real thing you can do with an actual semi-historically accurate duke. I mean, obviously they won't be completely historically accurate anyway, but if the word duke is to mean anything, it just unbalances things catastrophically.
Yeah, I was in a conversation once about this where we sort of concluded that, in modern Regency romance, the Duke stands in for a particular modern type of character, the wealthy, powerful, the Bill Gates type. Maybe not Bill Gates because he's not exactly pretty, but where it's actually got nothing to do with the historical class status. It's basically the billionaire romance, but with a title slapped onto it.
Exactly, and the problem is because you can absolutely get away with that if you're looking at the relatively minor aristocracy. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about dukes, who are, there's 27 of them across the entire Regency. But also they're people who own, like, most of the country. Like, even now, the Duke of Westminster, for example, you look at his land holdings, and he owns, like, a sizable percentage of the whole of Britain. We're not messing about here. They still own the country. There's a tiny number of people. A duke is one step down from the king. They're a hugely important sort of social status thing. So both messing about with who they can marry, but also the idea that they had this completely carefree life where they didn't have to do anything.
And where they can get away with personal lives that wouldn't really survive scrutiny, Well,
I mean, they could certainly, shag around as much as they want. And they could probably get away with marrying incredibly unsuitable people. There are, like, Lord Euston, the Earl of Euston, was the Duke's of somebody or other's eldest son, Earl of Grafton, Castle, I forget. Anyway, he was certainly a Duke's eldest son, and he did indeed marry a woman out of the music hall. So it did happen. That was in the Victorian era, and it went horrific wrong, as you might expect. But they could probably marry people that they wanted to because they were so powerful, but because they were so powerful, they really wouldn't have had to. Mm-hmm. So it just puts too much power on one side. That's such a problem when you're trying to write a romance and make it work and make people believe in a happy ever after, I think. And you've got to end up with some kind of power balance.
So that brings up an interesting topic that I keep wanting to explore, ideally with, an entire panel full of queer historical writers, which is that the legal and social context for men and women, for queer men and women in history, was very different from each other. So in writing, both the possibilities and the perils for queer men to have a happily ever after romance, as opposed to queer women, that would be very different. They would have different types of hazards, different types of opportunities, and different types of potential outcomes. How did you deal with that in, deciding to write a female romance?
Well, I mean, it takes away a huge chunk of the sort of the obvious problem, the peril. I don't greatly like writing male romances where the big threat is we might get caught and, you know, executed.
Yeah.
That's, you know,
and of course,
you want to take people away.
I was going to say, of course, in England, that was specifically a male hazard. That the significant difference was that in the English legal system, female homosexuality was not even recognized, much less penalized.
Yes, exactly. So there's just no issue at all. People saw women having, quote marks, lifelong strong friendships and being terribly, terribly fond of one another. And probably knew exactly what was going on. You know, they've just made that film Gentleman Jack about
Anne Lister, yeah.
Very well known. And whereas if you do male homosexuality, then there's a point at which it could lead to execution, although, yeah, that stops in about 1836, 1837 or so. But then after that, you've got, you know, punitive laws, and you've also got the fact that a lot of juries didn't want to convict because the laws were so grossly unfair, which is obviously a thing that happened. And you've got all this complicated legal structure, and that's just taken away if you're writing FF. You know, the characters don't have that horrible thing hanging over them. So from that perspective, it was something of a relief. But then on the other hand, as you say, it wasn't even recognised. So instead of having a relationship that dare not speak its name and could open you up to punishment, you've got a relationship that, you know, the world literally doesn't believe could possibly exist or mean anything. You know, you can't even be arrested for it. There's just, you know, it's just treated as a non-thing, which I think is differently awful.
Yeah, and in comparison to men's lives, the problem for women, even women from, you know, the upper classes, was that they had a lot less power to live independent lives.
Yes, of course. If you don't have an independent income, then you're in trouble. You're very likely not to inherit anything if your parents have money at all. If you do marry, up until distressingly late on, all of your property immediately becomes your husband's. So you have these women who were just totally at the mercy of men, effectively. And that is, you know, and certainly, you know, it would be very difficult for a young woman to, for example, leave her father's home and go off with her, quote mark, very dear friend. You know, she goes off with a lover, and, you know, whether they know it's a lover or not, if they just want her to come home, it is possible for the father to just go and bring her home, because even a woman in her early 20s, because women just have no power. So that's, you know, a constant theme of British history, really, isn't it?
And yet we have time after time examples of women who did succeed in doing that. So I think sometimes I talk to people who think that the general rule, you know, the rule that women were always under a man's control was universal, and think, well, there's no point in writing stories about, you know, independent women in history because they didn't exist, and that's just as wrong.
Of course they existed, but they needed the facility to be independent, right. Which takes us back to money.
Yes.
You know, you can't be independent if you've got nothing to live on, so you've got to earn your bread. So if you are, for example, a woman, you know, of a reasonably good family, who hasn't been left any money, but also hasn't been educated to do a job, then you're really up a gum tree.
Yeah, and I was going to say, in that social stratum where women did not work, you know, where you didn't really even have the social option of going out and working.
Yeah, where there was no job available. And then alternately, you know, you had women who were from a slightly lower social stratum who could run their own businesses very successfully, yes. Who would own their own shop, who could, you know, be crafting, making things, selling things. If you're able to teach, you know, that there were absolutely options. So one of the things in proper English is that my heroine has, she's been basically taking care of the house, first for her father and then for her older brother, and now her older brother is married, and she literally has no role anymore. She's been the woman who runs this house all this time, and now she's just completely supplanted, and that's just her tough luck. And she's got a small independent income that she's been left, but she now has her entire life. That's it. You know, her life was serving this bloke. Now she's got to find an entire new place to start because her brother got married. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of thing, which is, you know, it's not a disaster for her, but it's an unpleasant upheaval of her life, because there's no role in a patriarchal system really for her as a daughter who doesn't want to get married.
So you've touched a little bit on this next question, because you talk about your love of this particular type of mystery setting. But so I think most of your books have been sort of in the long 19th century, as it were, Regency, Victorian, Edwardian eras. Even when you include fantasy elements, it's pretty clear you're in love with those eras. So what's the attraction of history and of that particular span of history for you as an author?
Oh, well, I'm very fond of there not being mobile phones in my stories. I think that's an absolute... I once wrote a story with a mobile phone. Absolutely ruins the whole thing. How can you plot around those blasted things? I hate them. So yeah, never going to do one of them. I like the 1920s very much. I think the sort of interwar period's enormous. I think there's a whole interesting range, and a lot of it is to do with the interaction of technology and the way society was developing, and also the freedom of the increased movement that people had, so that you're looking at much more potentially diverse casts and going to different places and people having different experiences, different life experiences. And I think when you're writing much earlier Georgian, the earliest I've done is I think 1805, and when you get much earlier than that, it's very difficult for people to move around at all unless they're staggeringly rich. Mm-hmm. And then you just get these quite very tiny worlds, which I'm not so comfortable writing myself. But yeah, I just very much enjoy that entire span of history. And I read a lot in them, and you get a lot of Pulp Fiction. My imagination is driven by Pulp Fiction.
So you've been, if I may say, wildly successful with your core product, if I can call it a product. What is your core product is male fiction. What was your professional goal in branching out to an FF story? So is it something that your existing readership was clamoring for, or are you trying to pick up a new set of readers that way?
I wish that I thought in such professionally competent terms. I actually really just wanted to write the story. I felt, there is definitely an issue with FF. I mean, obviously, as we know, the sales just do not reflect what the sales of MM are, and that is, I think, something that can and will change. But I felt reasonably sure that enough people, modesty aside, I have people who like to read my stuff, and I felt fairly confident that it would repay my time investment, and it seems to be doing pretty nicely, so I'm fine with that. But it was not so much... It was really, I really wanted to write the characters. They were just itched and itched and itched at my head, and there was the story was right there for them, and that was actually the driving factor. But I would like to write more. I'm writing an MF at the moment. I just feel like I'm settling into writing female voices in the way I haven't done before, and I'm going to be doing a variety of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's been something of... I'm not sure it's up to the level of a trend yet, but in the last half year or so, there has been an assortment of romance authors, fairly well-known romance authors in some cases, who typically write either MF couples or MM couples, who have tried their hand at FF. There's your book. There's Courtney Milan with Mrs. Martin's Incomparable Adventure, Lily Maxton with A Lady's Desire, which is a Regency. And Cat Sebastian has an upcoming FF, A Little Light Mischief. So
and
is this...
Olivia Waite's got a trilogy coming with Avon. That's what I'm excited about, because I think the three that you've just named are all novellas, and there's been a bit. I don't know if you recall, but there was a period where publishers were sort of doing MF series and then allowing authors to do an MM novella to sort of attach to the MF series, like dipping their toe into the market, as it were. And I think we've seen a bit of that with publishers and FF. So I'm really excited that Avon has committed to a proper 3-book novel deal for Olivia Waite with The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics.
Yeah, I didn't mention that because I wasn't thinking of her in the category of having originally been known for...
Oh, yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah. I'm just excited about that as a concept. Yes, no, well, you're right. I think maybe it's just a thing whose time has come. I don't know. Maybe, I can't speak for anyone else, but, and Alyssa Cole wrote, has added an FF to her Reluctant Royal series. So hopefully it's just that people are seeing more, maybe there is more market opportunity. I don't know.
I would love if there became, more widespread market opportunities for FF historicals. I would be a little worried if that opportunity was only available to people who'd already established a career with other types of couples.
That's the thing, isn't it? You don't want people, crowding out. What I'm rather hoping will happen, obviously, is that authors of MM or MF will bring their readers in. That people will say, well, I'll read this because it's Courtney Milan, and then say, oh wow, I really like that. Maybe I'll read another one by somebody else, and actually just learn not to be scared of reading something outside their original comfort zone. And I think that could, I think that could happen. We've seen that readers do push their boundaries once they, Suzanne Brotman, for example, really brought a lot of readers to MM. I think, so hopefully it will have that effect rather than punishing the authors of FF, which would be obviously the worst effect. But I don't think, romance readers are so voracious. I don't really think there's that much scope for... There can be only one thing. Romance readers want as many books as possible. That's their pretty much defining characteristic.
But there is this interesting phenomenon, and I had a long 2-part podcast with Anna Clutterbuck-Cook about this, who had a lot of fascinating opinions and observations, that you get these siloed communities, and especially around queer fiction, where people know about and read within a particular community of authors and readers, and don't even know that the others exist. So you've got like all these different smaller communities that are saying, I want more FF fiction, but it doesn't exist. And what they mean by doesn't exist either is the people that I am reading don't write it, or the people who are writing it aren't hitting my sweet spot in some way. That there's, because let's be honest, there's this enormous small press and self-published industry of FF romance. And when people who read, say in your reading community, either don't know about it or they say, oh, but those books aren't doing the thing I'm looking for. And it creates this fascinating dynamic of scarcity where everybody says, I want this thing, and it's so scarce and nobody's writing it. Why is nobody writing it? And everybody out there in all the other communities is saying, hey, when am I chopped liver?
Is that because I've been looking a lot for FF historical romance, and one of the things I really come across is the completely different pricing issue. So, you get publishers who are doing plenty of it, but you're looking at a $9.99 price tag on an ebook very often. I'm not taking a punt on a $9.99 ebook the way I am on a $2.99 ebook. I read far too much. I go bankrupt.
Yeah.
And I do think that's significant. All right, this is an awful thing to admit. I've never read a Justine Saracen book yet because they're really highly priced. And I keep thinking, so I've got the sort of sale alert thing on, but, it's so expensive.
Yeah, and I know only sort of superficially about the market dynamics of that, but part of that is that those are, both Bold Strokes books and my publisher, Bella Books, they're doing a, both ebook and physical book marketing strategy, and the dynamics of publishing books and distributing books in hard copy and having a professional organization to do that, so employees and warehouses.
I used to work in publishing, so
and I find that the pricing is aligned with mainstream publishing. So if you're used to buying, books from a mainstream publisher, the pricing isn't that different. What's different is the assumed contract with the reader about what you're getting.
Well, Well, I don't know if because I find the prices in those publishers quite high even for mainstream, because a lot of publishers are now moving to the thing where they actually do price the ebook a lot lower in the hope of selling a lot more copies. So I would say it's still a bit high, but also it's So I'm basically might be priced for the historical fiction market, but I'm not looking for that. If I'm looking for a romance novel, I know what romance pricing looks like, and it doesn't look like that. And that just puts me off taking a punt. And, I've got reasonable disposable income. I'm not broke, but I'm still, there's a point where something is just too expensive. If it's way out of the market price. It certainly won't be at the top of my massively long list of things I want to spend money on. If I could think I could actually get 3 contemporary FF novels, or I could get, this, all the many millions of other things I want to read. So I do honestly think it's a problem.
Yeah.
So, and there are other silos, as you say, where that's not the issue. And one of the phenomena that I've found really quite interesting as I've been sort of scrabbling around for reading more FF is how much of it is very heavily fanfic influence. So you sort of see that in style, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and then you get that, and that's obviously a huge thing, and people are obviously writing loads of it. And I have to say, it's not a style that I find particularly enjoyable, but it's a style that obviously really works for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But that's an entire group of people just doing their own thing. So yes, it is interesting, but with luck, if the big publishers are doing it and people are self-publishing who've got a certain amount of crossover appeal, I hope that it will manage to break down a few of the walls between silos, or at least little tunnels between silos. We could dig a tunnel.
I like that image, yeah. So do you have any current projects that you think our listeners might get excited about that you can talk about?
The one that I think your listeners would be most aligned to is also one that I'm havering on. It's the sequel to my book Spectred Isle, which was one I wrote set in 1920s, and it's paranormal and it's post-war and everything has gone terribly wrong because of occult attacks. And that's going to be an FF between a woman who is sort of the avatar of a London deity and a woman who is dead. So, bit of a snag. The relationship's fine. The relationship's great. I'm really looking forward to writing that. But the overarching plot has been giving me a lot of problems because trying to write sort of a world going terribly wrong at the moment is a bit
too close to home.
It is a bit. So I've been struggling with that. But I hope that will be my next FF project. It's going to be called Last Couple in Hell. And
I've been seeing you mention it for quite a while now, so it's been on my radar.
Well, I feel like I've made a breakthrough on the concept. So I'm finishing at the moment my sequel to Any Old Diamonds, which is going to be an MF story with quite a feisty female lead. And then hopefully I'm going to Last Couple in Hell. And we will just see if that works out.
So if people wanted to follow you on social media, where should they look?
On Twitter, which is where I spend most of my time. And also I've got a group called KJ Charles Chat on Facebook, which is an extremely nice and very, very hungry for FF historical romance. Incidentally, it's a place where people absolutely leap on any that I can recommend. So if anyone's got anything to talk about in the way of FF historicals, they're welcome to come in and chat.
Uh-huh. Well, that's wonderful. I will have links to all of those and to the books we've discussed in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us on the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, KJ.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.